Nikolas Cruz. I mean, the question is going to be asked whether someone like this had access and could get access to buying a gun. And that's because he might have had a history of mental issues or even violent issues, but that somehow never made it to his records, which a gun store owner would have access to before approving or denying, a license for a gun or getting a gun. Do you believe that there should be a better standard by which we can track those who, even anecdotally, have worried others?
Well, I mean, that becomes basically a Star Chamber-esque thing because, people right. misuse the system as it is already. I mean, so
you fear this would go too far and not necessarily catch the criminal intent?
Exactly. I think it has the potential to really get overly broad. Absolutely. Okay.
If you could just hang in there, Congressman, I want to bring former FBI Assistant Director Chris Swecker into this. You're watching a live shot inside this Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Broward County courtroom where the assailant's public defender is trying to argue about keeping certain court records sealed that might be damaging either to his case or might be unfairly biasing his case. Anyone's guess as to what that could be. But, Chris, a lot of it goes back to this Snapchat video in which he's harming himself, cutting his arms, and making a number of threatening remarks. Should that be something that is included? Because a lot of other things are going to be.
Well, when it comes to this type of threat and violence, I think everything has to be on the table. We give banks safe harbor when they report suspicious banking transactions. We should be able, nobody should be afraid to report information because of HIPAA or being sued or some privacy law. And I think that that's something that's not being discussed right now, is that whole aspect of fear on the part of people to actually report activities and proactively follow up on it and then take it to the police department wherever it needs to go.
Chris, when you hear this back and forth, I was discussing with the congressman about whether this makes the FBI look bad and maybe its resources were compromised because, as the president said, it was all focused on this Russia investigation, and its real job of chasing down potential problem cases or potential mass killers like this was compromised. Do you buy that?
No, I don't buy that. That's ludicrous. What you're talking about here is a policy or a strategy that was implemented after 9/11 to funnel all FBI tips into one place so they could supposedly connect the dots. So under this scheme, everything on the tip line goes to in the catacombs of West Virginia at the criminal information justice system, and it is it's a sterile environment in the sense that it's an assembly line call center type environment. I think that has nothing to do with the Russia investigation. It's not diverting any resources from anywhere. It just is a policy and a practice that we need to overhaul and revisit.
All right, now you've heard by now the criticism of the FBI, Chris, about how it dropped the ball on this one, this phone call on the 5th of January from someone who knew Cruz very, very well, that, detailing all the problems that he had, sporadic rantings on social media, harming animals, a threat to himself, a threat to others, increasingly crazy actings and behavior. On that, somehow that was not communicated, I guess, to the FBI Miami office. And the FBI director himself came out and apologized for that. The governor of Florida has come out and said, he should resign over that. What do you think of that?
Well, as Chris has admitted, this is a colossal mistake on the part of the FBI, and I think it's a breakdown deep down inside that call center. It's not something that would have raised up to Chris Wray's level, but perhaps it should have sometime as he drinks from the fire hose and gets used to being the director of the FBI. I doubt that he had turned his attention to that just yet, but it is something that it's public interfacing. It needs to be looked at and it needs to be fixed. There's no way to gloss this over. It's a huge mistake.
Congressman, we still have you, sir. I mean, there's been a move on the part of Democrats to say it's the Republicans' fault for resisting, reining in the number of guns or the severe guns that people like this are allowed to get. How do you feel about that, and whether there is a middle ground here, even Democrats who might find themselves also reluctant to take on Hollywood when it comes to violent video games and movies and that sort of thing, that maybe there is a middle ground here that both attack their sacred cows.
Well, I just think that that's unfortunate that you have scapegoating going on. I mean, most Americans still believe in the Second Amendment right as a fundamental, inherent constitutional right. And the bottom line is, you know, if you take a look at the Texas shooting, that you had an armed civilian who basically brought that to a close. The Steve Scalise shooting and the congressional shooting, you had armed Capitol Police there. It's not the guns; it's malevolent hearts. It's people with evil intention that we really have to agree is where we need to stop the breakdown. We need to prevent those people. And that's where it's really difficult, because our system is basically one that we prosecute crimes after they've been committed. We don't have the ability to anticipate always and stop crimes. So we're in a very delicate situation. So I don't think the scapegoating really helps either side.
All right, Congressman, thank you very much. We appreciate it. With all this other breaking news, back to Chris Swecker, former FBI Assistant Director. Chris,
thank you.
This is one of those rare occasions, Chris, where the perpetrator behind a mass attack, a mass shooting, is alive and well. And we can go ahead and see the legal process unfold. As a former FBI guy, how do you want to see it unfold?
Well, this is one of those cases where there's no question who did it. It's a question of whether he was legally insane under the legal definition of insanity. What I'd like to really come out of this is to learn everything we can about this and update some of the information that we have about these types of shootings. And there's a lot of opportunities we see here. This is really...
All right. Hang on to that, Chris.
A great case
this is just starting, and I do want to go back to you. Now, this event has begun.
We're here on the case of Cruz. Are all of the attorneys present?
They're bringing them on behalf of the state, Your Honor.
Oh, Liz McGill, I'm sorry.
Sharon Day on behalf of the state.
Liz McGill is also present. The defendant is also present. Yes. Mr. Cruz is present. Liz McGill on his behalf.
Diane, Mr. Cruz.
Great. Let me start off by saying that although I didn't consider any of these matters to be confidential, an order has been entered on Friday by Judge Rivolo. I have reviewed these materials thoroughly, and they deal solely with the public defender's office having access to their own client's person while in the Broward County Jail. I don't believe that the state has suffered any prejudice by these matters being kept confidential, and I am going to leave everything the way it is, with the caveat that in the future, going forward, all matters in this case are going to be heard by this court. And if there is a motion to keep something confidential, the motion, at the very least, is going to be heard by this court in the presence of all of the lawyers and the defendants. Does anyone have any questions?
Judge, are you keeping those orders under seal?
An order has already been entered. Again, I believe I made it clear on Friday that I didn't feel it should be confidential, and I said it for today. But what's done is done. Again, it deals solely with the public defender's access or the defense's access to their own client's person, which, had the state been noticed, I don't think the state would have had any objection or any standing to object to them accessing their own client. Because the issue is so very limited, as far as I can tell, I'm going to leave it the way it is. And just, again, I have a copy of the administrative order for each of you, so that you know in the future the matters are going to be heard by this court in Division FJ.
Judge, the only issue is that the state, pursuant to the case law as well as the rules, believe that whatever motions were filed by the defense should be accessible to both the state and to all parties. It is part of a court proceeding. I have found some case law that's directly on point that the defense is not entitled to conduct any type of discovery in secret. They did make a request, which was granted at magistrate court, to have access to their client for purposes of photographing him. The magistrate judge had no problem. but it is the state's position that whatever the court is in possession of as way as motions should be unsealed. Now, if you want the state to file a written motion unsealing it, we can certainly do that, but we are prepared today to argue why it should not be under seal.
I don't disagree with you. However, I just feel that because an order has already been issued by this court, meaning a judge in the 17th Circuit, that and because, like I said, it's a very limited issue. I believe the defense was entitled to what they were asking for, and this court has already ordered that the motions and the order be sealed. I'm going to just leave it the way it is.
Okay, we'll file the appropriate paperwork. Thank you.
Neil, did you want to say anything more?
Nothing at this time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Your Honor, would you be able to prepare a written order that reflects?
Sure. Thank you.
All right, continuing to watch this now. Nikolas Cruz, his legs shackled, his arms shackled, being led out of that courtroom right now. His public defender, of course, had wanted to keep under seal certain documents here. We're going to continue to see if she adds anything. Let's continue to listen if we can, guys. All right. Again, we're going to continue monitoring this here, but I want to get the read and get back with Chris Wecker, the former FBI assistant director. Also on the phone with us is Judge Andrew Napolitano. And Judge, what happened here? What was decided here?
Well, you know, in the Florida court system, you have different judges of different levels, and apparently an administrative judge, a judge who's in charge of procedure, issued an order that, in the defense lawyer's opinion, interfered with their ability to have access to their client. And the prosecutor said they supported that order because they want to know whenever defense lawyers are meeting with their client. Well, they're not entitled to know that. The defense is entitled to take pictures of him, and the defense is entitled to have him examined by psychiatrists. As Chris just said a few minutes before this proceeding started, the issue in this case is not who did it. The issue is whether or not he is mentally competent to stand trial, whether he was mentally competent at the time he did this, and whether he's mentally competent to perceive whatever punishment is appropriate, whether it's life in prison or whether it's the death penalty. And in order to address those issues, the defense lawyers have to spend time with him, and they have to have forensic psychiatrists with them as well. So that's pretty much what this dispute was about. How can they get access to their client? Does the state have to know about it? And by the way, Judge, who's the judge in this case, you or the other judge that interfered with our ability to get in there? And she said quite appropriately, I'm the judge. I'll hear all motions in this case, and you go see your client whenever you want.
So, Judge, if the only issue seems to be right now his mental state at the time of those killings, and maybe even prior, that's the only thing that could save him from the death penalty, right?
You know, his lawyers, it's a great question. His lawyers floated the idea, which I thought was a terrible thing to do strategically, but I've seen it before. We'll have him plead guilty and save you, the state, the anguish of a trial and the expense of a trial if you agree that you won't seek the death penalty, to which the state, in my view, quite properly responded, good grief, if there ever was a death penalty appropriate case, it's this. We don't know his mental status any more than you do, and it's far too early to address that. So the short answer to your question is they could conceivably negotiate him out of the death penalty. The longer answer is if he is competent and there is a trial, it's hard to believe that he could escape the death penalty.
Chris Wecker, a former FBI assistant director, much will be said and made, if it does go to a trial, regardless, I guess, whether he claims guilt or not, about who knew what and when. And again, we're back to that January 5th phone call from someone who knew Cruz very, very well, that he was, falling apart fast, and that he was a danger, and that this person thought a significant danger. And the FBI somehow, maybe at its Miami office level, or it never got it. So how do you feel about that coming up in what could be, a pretty bizarre trial at that?
Well, Judge Napolitano can correct me on this, but this isn't a civil case where you have the concept of intervening negligence and that sort of thing, or comparative negligence. I mean, ultimately the question is, did he do it? Was he legally, criminally insane when he did it? Those are the two big issues there. We know he did it, so it really comes out of the insanity defense. I don't think this is going to come into play in an actual trial. So, I mean, the real question is, what can we learn from this, and how can we fix it?
Well put. Judge, as you know, the president on this whole tragedy has said that if not for the distraction the FBI was having with this Russia investigation, this might not have happened, or that resources were siphoned away. I'm paraphrasing here. What did you think of that argument? How likely could that be in your eyes?
Let me say first that Chris is quite correct. The issue of who knew what when could conceivably come into play in a wrongful death lawsuit, but not in this criminal prosecution. I thought the president's comments were political comments intended to generate support from his base, but quite frankly, legally, they are of no moment. Chris knows this better than I do. There's probably about 8,500 to 9,000 FBI agents in the country. I don't know how many Bob Mueller has, but it can't be more than a few dozen. I don't think any of them are working out of the Miami field office. So I really don't think that the FBI's eye was on the ball of Russia rather than the ball of properly addressing legitimate complaints to the West Virginia facility.
All right, gentlemen, I want to thank you both. And I always feel for parents of those 17 who died looking at these developments today, whether any of that matters. Their children are dead. We'll have more to this.